The stunning criminal discovery that would bring the FBI director himself to a forgotten frontier town. A legendary outlaw treasure that had remained hidden for over 150 years. All triggered by one widow's desperate attempt to rebuild her shattered life against impossible financial ruin, and the crumbling homestead that concealed what historians would call the most significant Wild West archaeological find in American history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The February snow crunched beneath Margaret Chen's worn boots as she stepped out of her dented pickup truck and stared at what was now supposedly her property. At 42, the recently widowed former nurse had received the certified letter 6 weeks earlier, informing her that a distant great-aunt she'd never heard of had left her a homestead property in the small town of Copper Ridge, Montana. Population 847. Margaret clutched the foreclosure notice that had arrived the same day as the inheritance paperwork. After her husband David's 3-year battle with cancer had drained their savings, maxed their credit cards, and consumed their retirement funds, she faced bankruptcy proceedings and the loss of their family home in Seattle. The medical bills alone totaled over $340,000, and her part-time nursing work barely covered basic living expenses for herself and her 16-year-old daughter, Rachel. "Mum, this place looks like it's been abandoned since the 1800s, Rachel observed, pulling her winter coat tighter as she examined the weathered log structure with its sagging porch and broken windows. The homestead sat on 47 acres of snow-covered prairie, surrounded by rolling hills and distant mountain peaks that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. Margaret studied the property deed in her frozen hands. Built in 1871 by Ezra Blackwood, according to the legal documents, though she'd never heard that family name mentioned by any relatives. The structure appeared to be original frontier construction, with hand-hewn logs and a stone foundation that spoke to the craftsmanship of earlier eras. As they stood contemplating their unexpected inheritance, a rusted Ford pickup approached. On the gravel road, an elderly man in a worn cowboy hat stepped out, introducing himself as Tom Reeves, the neighboring rancher who'd been keeping an eye on the Blackwood place for the past decade. "Didn't expect anyone to claim this old spread," Tom said, his weathered face showing genuine surprise. "Most folks around here figured it would eventually go to the county for back taxes. Your great-aunt, Miss Evelyn Blackwood, lived here alone for 60 years after her parents passed. Strange woman, kept to herself mostly, but sharp as a tack, until the day she died last autumn." Margaret frowned. "I've never heard of Evelyn Blackwood. Are you certain we're related?" Tom scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, she seemed mighty sure about having a great niece named Margaret in Seattle, talked about you specifically during her final months, said you'd be needing the place when the time came. Peculiar how she knew about your circumstances without ever meeting you." The mystery deepened as Tom led them inside the homestead. Despite its external deterioration, the interior revealed a surprisingly well-maintained living space. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace, handcrafted furniture that appeared to be original frontier pieces, and walls lined with books, maps, and what looked like historical documents under protective glass. Miss Evelyn was quite the local historian, Tom explained, noting Margaret's interest in the displayed materials. Spent decades researching the early settlers, particularly the original homesteaders from the 1870s. Said this land held more history than most folks realized. Rachel discovered a modern kitchen that had been carefully updated while maintaining the homestead's historical character. Professional-grade appliances had been installed alongside restored vintage fixtures, and the wide plank wooden floors showed evidence of meticulous maintenance despite the building's age. "Look at this, Mom," Rachel called from near the kitchen's center island. "There's something weird about this floor section." Margaret joined her daughter, noting that several floorboards appeared slightly different in color and grain pattern from the surrounding wood. When she knelt to examine them more closely, she discovered that these particular boards were not nailed down like the others, but rather fitted with hidden hinges that allowed them to lift. "Tom, was Evelyn doing renovation work in here?" Margaret asked, though something about the boards suggested they had been designed this way originally. Tom looked puzzled. "Not that I ever saw. She was pretty secretive about the inside of the house, never invited folks in much, but she did mention once that the original builder, Ezra Blackwood, was known for his clever carpentry work." As they explored further, Margaret discovered that Evelyn had left detailed records of her research into the homestead's history. A cedar chest in the main bedroom contained leather-bound journals documenting her investigations into Ezra Blackwood's background, along with copies of historical newspaper articles, territorial records, and correspondence with various historical societies. One journal entry, dated just 6 months before Evelyn's death, caught Margaret's attention. "The family connection has been confirmed through genealogical research. Margaret Chen, née Blackwood, carries the bloodline necessary to complete what Ezra began. The signs align with the timing he predicted. She will arrive when desperation meets opportunity, as it was meant to be." Margaret stared at the entry, her mind reeling. Her maiden name had indeed been Blackwood, though she'd never traced her family history back beyond her grandparents. The suggestion that Evelyn had been tracking her lineage and predicting her arrival seemed impossible, yet here was documentary evidence written in the elderly woman's careful handwriting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rachel found another intriguing document tucked behind a framed photograph. It was a hand-drawn map of the property, but with significant differences from the current layout. The map showed additional structures that no longer existed, underground root cellars, and most mysteriously, a detailed floor plan of the house with specific measurements and notations about secured storage beneath the kitchen area. "Mom, this map shows something under the kitchen floor," Rachel observed, comparing the drawing to their earlier discovery. "Look, there are measurements and notes about depth and construction materials." That evening, staying in the homestead's surprisingly comfortable bedrooms, Margaret couldn't sleep. She found herself drawn to Evelyn's research materials, reading by lamplight about Ezra Blackwood's fascinating history. According to territorial records, he had arrived in Montana Territory in 1870, purchased the land with cash in an era when most settlers struggled to afford basic supplies, and completed construction of an unusually sophisticated homestead within a single year. More intriguingly, Ezra had been mentioned in several newspaper accounts from the 1870s as a skilled craftsman who had built hidden compartments and secure storage areas for other settlers concerned about Indian raids and outlaw gangs that plagued the territory during that lawless period. One newspaper clipping from 1873 caught her attention. Local carpenter Ezra Blackwood continues to provide ingenious security solutions for territorial families concerned about protecting their valuables from the notorious Dalton Gang and other criminal elements known to operate in the region. Margaret's heart rate increased as she read further. The Dalton Gang had been one of the most successful outlaw groups of the era, known for bank and train robberies across the Western Territories. Historical accounts suggested they had operated in Montana for several years before disappearing mysteriously in 1874, with their stolen wealth never recovered. A separate document in Evelyn's collection was a letter dated 1874, apparently written by Ezra himself. "The arrangement has been completed as agreed. The storage chamber beneath the kitchen foundation will preserve the items safely until circumstances permit proper disposition. Future generations of the bloodline will know when the time is appropriate for recovery." Margaret sat back, trying to process the implications of what she was reading. If Ezra Blackwood had indeed created a hidden storage chamber beneath the kitchen, and if he had been connected to the activities of outlaw gangs in the 1870s, there might be something of significant historical value hidden in her inheritance. The next morning, Margaret called the number listed for the estate attorney who had handled Evelyn's will. James Morrison, a lawyer in the county seat of Glacier Falls, agreed to meet with her that afternoon to discuss the inheritance details. Morrison's office was filled with historical photographs and artifacts from the region's frontier period. He greeted Margaret with the demeanor of someone who had been expecting this conversation for some time. "Miss Blackwood left specific instructions regarding your inheritance," Morrison explained, retrieving a thick folder from his filing cabinet. "She was quite insistent that certain information only be shared after you had spent time at the homestead and begun investigating its history." He handed Margaret a sealed envelope marked "For Margaret Chen," to be opened only after initial residence established. Inside was another letter from Evelyn, written in the same careful handwriting Margaret had seen in the journals. "My dear great-niece," the letter began, "if you are reading this, you have discovered the beginning of what our ancestor Ezra left for future generations. The financial difficulties that brought you to this property are not coincidence, but rather the fulfillment of a plan set in motion 150 years ago." The letter continued, "Ezra Blackwood was not merely a carpenter, but a strategic thinker who understood that the wealth accumulated during the territorial period would need to be preserved for descendants who would face their own times of crisis. The chamber beneath the kitchen contains more than historical artifacts. It contains the solution to your current difficulties and the foundation for your family's future prosperity." Margaret looked up at Morrison, who was watching her reaction. Carefully, "Mr. Morrison, what exactly did Evelyn know about my financial situation?" The attorney smiled slightly. "Miss Blackwood was remarkably well informed about many things, Mrs. Chen. She maintained correspondence with various genealogical services and had been tracking your family's circumstances for several years. She seemed to believe that timing was crucial for what she called the revelation." "She knew about David's illness? About our bankruptcy?" Morrison nodded. "She received regular updates about your situation through private investigation services she employed. She wanted to ensure that when you inherited the property, you would be motivated to explore its complete potential rather than simply selling it immediately." As Margaret absorbed this information, Morrison continued, "There are specific legal conditions attached to your inheritance, similar to what your ancestor apparently established. You must maintain ownership of the property for a minimum of 1 year before any sale can be considered, and you must personally investigate what Miss Blackwood called the historical preservation project that she believed was your family responsibility." "What kind of historical preservation project?" Rachel asked, having listened to the conversation with growing excitement. Morrison retrieved another document from Evelyn's file. According to her instructions, the homestead contains artifacts and materials related to significant events in territorial history. She believed these discoveries would be of interest not only to local historians, but potentially to federal authorities responsible for investigating historical crimes and recovering stolen property. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. Stolen property. "Mrs. Chen, your great-aunt spent decades researching territorial period crimes, particularly unsolved cases involving missing wealth from bank and train robberies. She believed your ancestor Ezra had come into possession of materials that would be considered evidence in what would now be federal criminal cases, even though the crimes occurred over a century ago." The implications were staggering. Margaret had inherited not just a homestead, but potentially a crime scene containing evidence from some of the most notorious outlaw activities of the American frontier period. As they drove back to the homestead that afternoon, Margaret's mind raced with possibilities. Her desperate financial situation had led her to what might be one of the most significant historical discoveries of the modern era: the hidden chamber. Beneath the kitchen floor could contain artifacts worth far more than her medical debts, but it might also attract attention from federal authorities and historians. That evening, Margaret made a decision that would change not only her family's future, but potentially rewrite the historical record of the American frontier period. She would open Ezra Blackwood's hidden chamber and discover what her ancestor had preserved for future generations of their bloodline. What Margaret couldn't possibly know as she prepared to lift those carefully crafted floorboards was that her discovery would soon bring FBI investigators, Smithsonian historians, and eventually the attention of the highest levels of government to this remote Montana homestead, transforming her from a bankrupt widow into the custodian of one of the most significant archaeological finds in American frontier history. The morning sun cast long shadows across the homestead's kitchen as Margaret knelt beside the mysterious floorboards, her heart pounding with anticipation and uncertainty. Rachel had insisted on documenting everything with her phone camera, understanding instinctively that whatever they were about to discover would need careful record-keeping. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Rachel asked, though her excitement was barely contained. "What if there's nothing down there? What if we're just chasing some old woman's fantasies?" Margaret ran her fingers along the expertly crafted hinges that Ezra Blackwood had installed 150 years earlier. The metalwork showed no signs of rust or deterioration, suggesting maintenance over the decades that seemed impossible given the homestead's apparent abandonment. "Sometimes the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards," Margaret replied, echoing advice David had given her during their early years together when they had taken chances on investments that had ultimately funded their comfortable life before his illness. "We've lost everything we thought was secure. Maybe it's time to trust in something uncertain." With careful pressure, Margaret lifted the first floorboard. Beneath lay not the dirt foundation she had expected, but rather a wooden ladder descending into darkness. The construction was remarkable: mortise and tenon joints that had held perfectly for over a century, with rungs made from what appeared to be oak that showed no signs of rot or weakness. Rachel shined her phone's flashlight down the opening, revealing a chamber approximately 8 feet deep with stone walls and what appeared to be wooden shelving along the perimeter. The air that rose from the opening was surprisingly fresh, suggesting ventilation systems that continued to function after all these years. "Mom, there's definitely something down there," Rachel whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the chamber. "I can see metal objects on the shelves and what looks like wooden crates." Margaret's nursing background had taught her to approach unknown situations systematically. She retrieved a flashlight from Evelyn's well-stocked utility closet and tested the ladder's stability before descending into what Ezra Blackwood had created beneath his frontier kitchen. The chamber was larger than it had appeared from above, roughly 12 feet square with a ceiling height that allowed Margaret to stand comfortably. The stone walls were fitted together with the precision of a master mason, and the floor was paved with flat stones that created a completely dry environment despite being below ground level. But it was the contents of the chamber that took Margaret's breath away. Along 3 walls, wooden shelves held an extraordinary collection of items that seemed to belong in a museum. Leather saddlebags bore the distinctive markings of various territorial banks. Metal strongboxes showed evidence of forced entry, their locks broken or removed entirely. Most remarkably, glass display cases contained organized collections of gold coins, silver dollars, and paper currency from multiple states and territories. "Rachel, you need to see this," Margaret called up to her daughter, her voice barely steady. "Bring your camera and be very careful on the ladder." When Rachel joined her in the chamber, both women stood in stunned silence. This wasn't simply a hiding place. It was a carefully curated archive of what appeared to be the complete proceeds from multiple criminal enterprises of the 1870s frontier period. A wooden table in the center of the chamber held leather-bound ledgers with detailed entries documenting the origins of each item. Ezra's meticulous handwriting recorded dates, locations, and specific details about bank robberies, train hold-ups, and stagecoach attacks that had occurred across Montana Territory and neighboring regions. "Mom, look at this entry," Rachel said, reading from one of the ledgers. "July 15th, 1873, First National Bank of Helena. $47,000 in gold coin and currency, recovered from Dalton gang cache following their departure from Territory. Items preserved pending resolution of legal ownership questions." Margaret examined additional entries, each more extraordinary than the last. Ezra had apparently intercepted and preserved the stolen wealth from multiple outlaw gangs, creating detailed documentation about the original crimes and the circumstances under which he had acquired the stolen property. One section of the ledger was particularly revealing. The territorial authorities lack the resources and jurisdiction to properly investigate these crimes or return stolen property to rightful owners. Future generations, with access to improved communication and law enforcement capabilities, will be better positioned to ensure justice for the victims of these criminal enterprises. He wasn't a criminal, Margaret realized, understanding flooding through her. He was trying to preserve evidence and stolen property until a time when proper justice could be served. The scope of Ezra's operation became clear as they continued exploring the chamber. A separate alcove contained weapons that had apparently been taken from various outlaw gangs, rifles, pistols, and knives, all carefully maintained and documented. Another section held personal effects that had been stolen from stagecoach passengers and train travelers, including jewelry, watches, and family heirlooms that Ezra had preserved with notes about their approximate origins. Most remarkably, a locked cabinet contained correspondence between Ezra and various territorial officials, revealing his secret cooperation with early law enforcement efforts. Letters from territorial marshals thanked him for information about outlaw movements and expressed frustration about their inability to recover stolen property due to limited resources and jurisdictional complications. "Rachel, do you understand what this means?" Margaret asked, the implications becoming overwhelming. "This isn't just historical artifacts. This is evidence from dozens of unsolved crimes, preserved by someone who was essentially operating as an undercover law enforcement asset." They spent the next 3 hours carefully documenting everything in the chamber, taking photographs and making detailed lists of the contents. The monetary value was staggering. Even accounting for historical fluctuations, the gold and silver alone would be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars at current precious metal prices. But the historical significance was even greater. This collection represented the most complete archive of frontier-period criminal activity ever discovered, with documentation that could finally provide closure for crimes that had remained unsolved for 150 years. As they prepared to leave the chamber, Margaret discovered a final surprise. Behind the main collection was a smaller alcove containing items that were clearly intended for Ezra's descendants. Modern analysis equipment that seemed impossibly advanced for the 1870s, detailed maps showing the locations of other hidden caches throughout the territory, and most remarkably, a letter addressed specifically to the Blackwood descendant who discovers this chamber. The letter, written in Ezra's distinctive handwriting, began, "To my future family member who reads this message, you have discovered what I preserved not for personal gain, but for justice that was impossible in my time. The wealth contained In this chamber belongs not to our family, but to the victims of the crimes from which it was stolen. However, the finder's fee for returning this property to rightful ownership will provide for your family's needs while serving the cause of historical justice." Margaret's hands trembled as she read further. "Contact the federal authorities responsible for investigating historical crimes. They will find that returning this property to descendants of the original victims and to historical institutions that can properly preserve it will result in compensation sufficient to resolve your current financial difficulties while serving a greater purpose than personal enrichment." That evening, Margaret sat at Evelyn's kitchen table with documents spread before her, trying to decide on the appropriate course of action. The smartphone number Evelyn had left in her final instructions connected her to James Morrison, who listened to her description of the discovery with growing amazement. "Mrs. Chen, what you've described is unprecedented in frontier historical research," Morrison said, his lawyer's training keeping his voice professional despite his obvious excitement. "I need to contact some colleagues who specialize in historical property recovery and federal jurisdiction issues." Within 2 hours, Morrison called back with a conference number connecting Margaret to Dr. Sarah Whitman, a Smithsonian institution, historian specializing in American frontier period crimes, and Special Agent Michael Torres of the FBI's Art Crime Team, which handled recovery of historically significant stolen property. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Whitman began, "if your description is accurate, you've discovered what may be the most significant cache of frontier period evidence ever found. The Dalton Gang case alone has been studied by historians for decades without resolution." Redeem, Special Agent Torres was more direct. "Ma'am, we need to arrange immediate federal oversight of this discovery. If you found evidence related to multiple bank robberies and other federal crimes, even historical ones, this requires official investigation and documentation." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention, but also recognized the opportunity that Ezra had intended for his descendants. "What does this mean for my family? We're facing bankruptcy, and this property is literally our last hope for financial stability." Dr. Whitman's response was reassuring. Federal law provides for substantial finder's fees when historically significant stolen property is recovered and returned to appropriate institutions or victim descendants. Based on your description, we're potentially talking about compensation in the hundreds of thousands of dollars range, plus additional payments from museums and historical societies for acquisition of the artifacts. "More importantly," Agent Torres added, "you'd be helping solve some of the most notorious unsolved crimes of the frontier period. The closure this could provide for descendant families who lost everything to outlaw gangs would be invaluable from a historical justice perspective." The next morning brought a convoy of federal vehicles to the remote Montana homestead. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as FBI evidence technicians, Smithsonian historians, and specialists from the National Archives began the careful process of documenting and preserving Ezra Blackwood's extraordinary legacy. Dr. Whitman supervised the chamber documentation with the reverence of someone handling priceless historical artifacts. "Mrs. Chen, your ancestor created the most sophisticated frontier period evidence preservation system we've ever encountered. This documentation will rewrite the historical record of law enforcement cooperation during the territorial period." Agent Torres was equally impressed with the legal implications. The correspondence between Ezra and territorial marshals proves that federal law enforcement was more organized and effective during this period than historians previously understood. This changes our understanding of frontier justice systems. As teams of experts work to catalog and preserve the discovery, Margaret received a call that would change her perspective on the entire situation. Professor James Mitchell from Montana State University's History Department had been contacted by the Smithsonian team and wanted to discuss the broader implications of her find. Mrs. Chen, what you've discovered isn't just about criminal history, Professor Mitchell explained. Ezra Blackwood appears to have been part of an organized network of civilian contractors who worked with early federal law enforcement to address the jurisdictional and resource problems that made frontier crime so difficult to prosecute. This revelation added another layer to the discovery's significance. If Ezra had been part of a coordinated federal law enforcement effort, then other similar caches might exist throughout the former frontier territories, waiting to be discovered by descendants who understood their historical importance. The financial implications became clear when federal appraisers completed their initial assessment. The precious metals alone were valued at over $400,000 in current market prices. The historical artifacts were worth additional hundreds of thousands to museums and collectors. Most significantly, the federal finder's fee program would provide Margaret with enough compensation to resolve her bankruptcy situation while funding Rachel's college education. But beyond the financial relief, Margaret found herself part of something much larger than personal survival. Dr. Whitman invited her to participate in a Smithsonian research project that would use Ezra's documentation to track down descendants of the original crime victims, finally providing closure and potentially recovered property to families who had been affected by frontier-period crimes. Mrs. Chen, your willingness to contact federal authorities rather than simply keeping this discovery private has made possible one of the most significant historical justice projects in American frontier research, Dr. Whitman told her. You're not just solving your own problems, you're helping solve historical injustices that have remained unaddressed for 150 years. As the federal investigation continued, Margaret realized that her desperate acceptance of an unexpected inheritance had led to discoveries that would impact far more than her own family's financial situation. Ezra Blackwood's legacy had been waiting for someone with both the need and the integrity to ensure that justice was served rather than personal profit prioritized. That evening, as Rachel helped her review the preliminary compensation agreements, Margaret reflected on how dramatically their situation had changed. From facing bankruptcy and homelessness, they now had not only financial security, but also a meaningful role in one of the most significant historical discoveries of the modern era. Mom, do you think Great-Aunt Evelyn knew this would happen? Rachel asked, looking through the federal documentation that would transform their lives. Margaret smiled, remembering Evelyn's precise planning and her seemingly impossible knowledge of their family's circumstances. I think she knew exactly what she was setting in motion. Sometimes the people who care about us most are the ones we never get the chance to meet. The third day of federal investigation brought developments that no one had anticipated. Margaret was preparing breakfast when Agent Torres received an urgent call that changed the entire trajectory of their discovery. His expression grew increasingly serious as he listened, and when he hung up, he immediately requested a secure conference call with his superiors. Mrs. Chen, we need to discuss something significant, Torres said, his professional demeanor unable to conceal his excitement. The serial numbers on some of the currency in your ancestors' collection have triggered alerts in our database. We're not just dealing with frontier period crimes anymore. Dr. Whitman joined them at the kitchen table as Torres explained the unexpected development. 3 of the banks that had been robbed in the 1870s had been predecessor institutions to modern national banks. More importantly, some of the stolen currency had serial number sequences that connected to a much larger pattern of financial crimes spanning multiple decades. What we've discovered, Dr. Whitman continued, is that the Dalton gang and their associates weren't just random outlaws. They appear to have been part of a sophisticated financial crime network that operated across state and territorial boundaries with remarkable organization and planning. Margaret felt her world shifting once again as the implications became clear. Are you saying this discovery connects to modern criminal investigations? Agent Torres nodded gravely. The documentation your ancestor preserved includes evidence of financial crime patterns that federal investigators have been trying to understand for decades. The serial number tracking, the coordination between different outlaw groups, the systematic targeting of specific financial institutions, it all suggests a level of organization that historians never suspected. A helicopter landing in the field behind the homestead announced the arrival of additional federal personnel. Margaret watched through her window as serious-looking individuals in suits emerged, including someone she recognized from news broadcasts as Assistant FBI Director Catherine Walsh. Mrs. Chen, Director Walsh greeted her with surprising warmth, despite the gravity of the situation. What your family has uncovered is far more significant than anyone initially realized. This discovery has triggered a review of some of our most important historical criminal investigations. The kitchen had been transformed into an impromptu command center, with federal agents, historians, and analysts working to understand the full scope of Ezra Blackwood's preserved evidence. Large displays showed maps connecting the locations of various crimes, timelines that revealed patterns spanning multiple years, and financial analyses that demonstrated the sophisticated nature of the criminal operations. Ma'am, your ancestor wasn't just preserving random stolen property, explained Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a federal financial crimes analyst who had flown in from Washington. He was documenting what appears to be one of the first organized financial crime syndicates in American history. The level of coordination and planning evidenced in these documents predates similar criminal organizations by decades. Rachel, who had been quietly observing the federal activity, made an observation that surprised the professional investigators. The dates in great-great-grandfather Ezra's ledgers follow a pattern. The crimes weren't random, they were timed to coincide with specific economic events and seasonal financial movements. Dr. Martinez examined Rachel's analysis with growing amazement. You're absolutely right. These crimes were planned around harvest seasons, cattle drives, and mining payouts when specific banks would have maximum cash reserves. This level of financial intelligence gathering was incredibly sophisticated for the 1870s. The discovery's significance escalated further when federal analysts found correspondence in Ezra's archives that had been written in code. The cipher system was complex enough that it required specialist cryptographers from the National Security Agency to decipher the messages, revealing communication between outlaw groups across multiple territories and states. Mrs. Chen, what your ancestor preserved is evidence of interstate criminal conspiracy on a scale that federal law enforcement wasn't equipped to handle in the 1870s, Director Walsh explained. But more importantly, the patterns documented here have helped us understand similar criminal networks that have operated throughout American history. Margaret struggled to process how her desperate search for financial stability had led to discoveries that were reshaping federal understanding of historical criminal organizations. What does this mean for my family? Are we in any danger because of what we've found? Director Walsh was reassuring but honest. There's no current threat to your safety, but the historical significance of this discovery means that federal oversight will continue for some time. The good news is that the compensation for your cooperation in this investigation has just increased substantially. The federal finder's fee had been recalculated based on the expanded scope of the discovery. Instead of the initial estimate of several $100,000, Margaret was looking at compensation in the millions of dollars range, plus ongoing consulting fees for her participation in the historical research project that would emerge from Ezra's preserved evidence. More importantly, Dr. Whitman added, "you'll be contributing to one of the most significant revisions of American frontier history ever undertaken. This discovery will change how historians understand the development of organized crime in America." As federal teams continued their work, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Professor Emily Hawthorne from Harvard University's History Department had driven through the night from Boston after learning about the discovery through academic networks. Her specialty was the intersection of frontier economics and criminal justice systems. "Mrs. Chen, I hope you understand the magnitude of what you've made possible," Professor Hawthorne said, reviewing the preliminary federal reports. "Your decision to contact authorities rather than keeping this discovery private has enabled the most comprehensive analysis of frontier-period organized crime ever attempted." The professor's perspective added another dimension to the discovery's importance. Academic institutions across the country are requesting access to this evidence for research projects that could take decades to complete. The licensing fees alone for scholarly access to Ezra's documentation will provide ongoing income for your family while contributing to historical understanding. That afternoon brought another surprise when Margaret received a call from the governor of Montana's office. Governor Patricia Reynolds wanted to meet with Margaret personally to discuss the state's interest in preserving the homestead as a historical site and ensuring that Montana received appropriate recognition for the discovery. "Mrs. Chen, this discovery has the potential to establish Montana as a premier destination for frontier history research and tourism," Governor Reynolds explained during their phone conversation. "The state is prepared to offer significant incentives to ensure that the homestead and its discoveries remain accessible for public education and historical research." The state's proposal included purchasing the mineral rights to the property at far above market value, establishing a research center on the homestead grounds, and providing Margaret with a permanent position as the site's historical consultant. The compensation package would ensure financial security for multiple generations of her family while preserving Ezra's legacy for public benefit. Rachel, who had been documenting everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood they were witnessing history, made another crucial observation. "Mom, look at the construction techniques Ezra used in the hidden chamber. This isn't just sophisticated carpentry. It's engineering that was ahead of its time." Federal structural engineers who had been called in to assess the chamber's preservation confirmed Rachel's insight. The ventilation systems, moisture control, and climate stability that had preserved the evidence for 150 years represented innovations that weren't widely used until the 20th century. "Your ancestor was remarkably ahead of his time in understanding preservation science," explained Dr. Margaret Chen, a conservation specialist from the National Archives. "The techniques he used to protect these materials could inform modern preservation efforts in similar environments." This revelation added yet another layer to the discovery's significance. Ezra hadn't just preserved criminal evidence, he had developed preservation technologies that could benefit modern historical conservation efforts. The patents and licensing opportunities for his preservation methods represented additional income potential for Margaret's family. As the federal investigation entered its second week, Margaret found herself at the center of something that had grown far beyond her initial desperate search for financial salvation. Media requests were arriving daily, though federal authorities were carefully controlling information release to protect the integrity of ongoing investigations. Dr. Whitman approached Margaret with an opportunity that would transform her role, from victim of circumstances to active participant in historical research. "Mrs. Chen, several universities are interested in offering you a position as a consulting researcher for frontier period studies. Your unique access to Ezra's documentation, combined with your family's historical connection to the events, makes you invaluable for ongoing research efforts." The university positions came with substantial salaries, research budgets, and opportunities for Rachel to receive full scholarships at any institution where Margaret chose to work. More importantly, they offered Margaret the chance to build a meaningful career from the discovery that had saved her family from financial ruin. Agent Torres provided updates on the broader implications of the investigation. Mrs. Chen, the evidence your ancestor preserved has helped us solve 17 different historical criminal cases. Descendant families who lost property in these crimes are finally getting closure after 150 years. The emotional impact of providing justice for historical victims added profound meaning to Margaret's discovery. Letters began arriving from descendant families expressing gratitude for finally learning what had happened to ancestors who had been victims of frontier-period crimes. One letter particularly moved Margaret. It came from Susan Morrison, whose great-great-grandmother had been robbed during a stagecoach attack in 1873. Dear Mrs. Chen, thanks to your discovery, our family finally knows what happened to my ancestors' jewelry and family heirlooms. Even though we can't recover the physical items, knowing they were preserved with care and respect by your ancestor gives us closure we never thought possible. The federal compensation agreements were finalized during the investigation's third week, providing Margaret with immediate relief from her bankruptcy situation, plus long-term financial security through consulting contracts and licensing agreements. But more importantly, the discovery had given her family a purpose that extended far beyond personal financial recovery. Rachel had been accepted into accelerated college programs based on her documentation work during the federal investigation. Her systematic approach to cataloging Ezra's evidence had impressed academic researchers enough that several universities offered her early admission with full scholarships and research positions. "Mom, a year ago we thought our lives were over," Rachel reflected as they reviewed the opportunities that had emerged from their discovery. "Now we're part of something that's helping people and changing history." Margaret nodded, understanding how dramatically their perspective had shifted. Sometimes our greatest challenges become the doorways to our greatest opportunities. Your father always said that tough times reveal strength we didn't know we had. As federal teams prepared to begin the careful removal and preservation of Ezra's evidence collection, Margaret realized that her inheritance had been far more than property or artifacts. Evelyn Blackwood had preserved not just historical evidence, but a family legacy of integrity and service that had transcended multiple generations. Director Walsh approached Margaret with news that would elevate the discovery's significance to the highest levels of government. "Mrs. Chen, the Attorney General has requested a briefing on this investigation. The patterns of criminal organization that your ancestor documented are helping federal authorities understand the historical development of organized crime in ways that inform current law enforcement efforts." The prospect of briefing federal leadership on her family's discovery seemed surreal to Margaret, who just months earlier had been struggling to pay basic living expenses. Yet she understood that Ezra's legacy carried responsibilities as well as opportunities. "I want to make sure that whatever comes from this discovery honors what Ezra intended," Margaret told Director Walsh. "He preserved this evidence for justice, not for personal gain. Any benefits my family receives should be balanced with service to the broader historical and legal purposes he had in mind." Director Walsh smiled with genuine respect. "Mrs. Chen, that attitude is exactly why this discovery has been so successful. Your integrity in handling this situation has made possible investigations and historical research that wouldn't have been feasible if the evidence had been handled differently." As the investigation continued to unfold, Margaret prepared for Developments that would soon bring the attention of the nation's highest leadership to her remote Montana homestead, transforming her from a desperate widow into a custodian of one of the most significant historical discoveries in American law enforcement history. The call from the White House came on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide Margaret's life into before and after. She was reviewing university research proposals when Agent Torres approached with an expression that had become familiar over the past month, the look of someone delivering news that would reshape everything they thought. They understood about their situation. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to sit down," Torres said, his usual professional composure barely containing his excitement. "The President has requested a personal briefing on your discovery. Air Force 2 will be arriving at the regional airport tomorrow morning." Margaret set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. "The President wants to come here, to Montana, because of what we found under our kitchen floor." Director Walsh, who had remained on site to coordinate the expanding investigation, joined them with confirmation that transformed the scope of their discovery once again. "Mrs. Chen, what your ancestor preserved has implications that extend far beyond historical research. The criminal network patterns documented in Ezra's evidence have helped federal authorities understand organized crime development in ways that inform current national security strategies." The transformation of the homestead over the following 24 hours was extraordinary. Secret Service teams established security perimeters around the property while maintaining the site's historical integrity. Military communications specialists installed secure systems that could handle classified briefings, and historians from the Smithsonian arrived with portable display equipment to present Ezra's discoveries to the nation's highest leadership. Rachel, who had become an integral part of the research team despite her age, was invited to participate in the presidential briefing based on her crucial observations about the criminal organization's operational patterns. Her systematic analysis of the timing and coordination of various crimes had provided insights that professional analysts had initially missed. "Mom, I can't believe we're going to meet the President because we followed Great-Aunt Evelyn's maps," Rachel said, reviewing her presentation notes with the seriousness of someone who understood the historical significance of the moment. Margaret smiled at her daughter's transformation from a teenager facing an uncertain future to a respected contributor to federal historical research. "A year ago, I thought our biggest problem was paying medical bills. Now we're helping solve crimes that happened before our great-grandparents were born." The presidential motorcade's arrival brought a level of attention that the remote Montana community had never experienced. Governor Reynolds accompanied the president, along with the Attorney General, Director of the FBI, and a team of advisors whose presence indicated the discovery's importance to current federal policy discussions. President Williams greeted Margaret with the warmth of someone who understood they were meeting an ordinary citizen who had made extraordinary contributions to national historical understanding. "Mrs. Chen, thank you for your integrity in handling this discovery. Your decision to contact federal authorities rather than keeping this find private has made possible one of the most significant law enforcement historical investigations in our nation's history." The briefing took place in Evelyn's carefully preserved main room, where displays showed the progression from Margaret's initial inheritance to the complex federal investigation that had emerged from Ezra's hidden chamber. Dr. Whitman presented the historical context, while federal analysts explained the contemporary law enforcement implications. "Mr. President, what Mrs. Chen discovered represents the earliest documented evidence of organized financial crime networks in American history," Attorney General Patricia Foster explained. The coordination between different outlaw groups, the sophisticated intelligence gathering about bank operations, and the systematic approach to territorial crime demonstrate organizational capabilities that federal law enforcement wasn't equipped to combat in the 1870s. The president studied the displays showing connections between various crimes, the financial analysis of stolen property recovery, and the impact on descendant families who had finally received closure about historical injustices. Mrs. Chen, you've not only preserved history, you've helped provide justice for families who thought they would never understand what happened to their ancestors. Rachel's presentation about the criminals' operational patterns impressed the presidential team with its thoroughness and insight. Mr. President, the timing of these crimes shows that the outlaw groups had access to financial information that should have been confidential. They knew when banks would have maximum cash reserves, when gold shipments would be traveling specific routes, and when law enforcement would be occupied with other priorities. FBI Director Jonathan Hayes expanded on Rachel's analysis. This level of intelligence gathering suggests corruption within territorial financial and law enforcement systems that historians never suspected. The evidence Mrs. Chen's ancestor preserved is helping us understand how organized crime evolved from these early networks into modern criminal enterprises. The president's questions revealed his deep understanding of the discovery's broader implications. Mrs. Chen, what made your ancestor different from other frontier settlers? Why did he choose to preserve evidence rather than keep the stolen wealth for personal use? Margaret referred to Ezra's correspondence, which she had studied extensively during the federal investigation. Mr. President, based on his writings, Ezra believed that justice delayed wasn't justice denied if the delay allowed for more complete investigation and resolution. He understood that territorial law enforcement lacked the resources to properly handle complex financial crimes, so he preserved everything until future generations could ensure proper justice. Dr. Martinez presented the financial analysis that had emerged from studying Ezra's preserved evidence. Mr. President, the total value of recovered stolen property exceeds $12 million in current currency. But more importantly, the criminal network this evidence documents was responsible for economic disruption that affected territorial development for decades. The president turned to Margaret with a proposal that would transform her role from private citizen to national historical consultant. Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to work with federal authorities to establish a research center here at the Homestead? This discovery deserves to be studied and preserved for future generations, and your family's connection to the evidence makes you uniquely qualified to oversee that effort. The Federal Research Center proposal included funding that would make the Homestead a permanent historical site while providing Margaret's family with substantial income and meaningful work. More importantly, it would ensure that Ezra's legacy continued to serve justice and historical understanding rather than personal enrichment. Mr. President, I want to make sure that anything we do honors what Ezra intended, Margaret replied. He preserved this evidence for justice, not for fame or profit. If establishing a research center here can help other families find closure and help law enforcement understand historical crime patterns, then that's what we should do. The president's response revealed why the discovery had attracted attention at the highest levels of government. Mrs. Chen, the patterns your ancestor documented are helping federal authorities understand the evolution of organized crime in ways that inform current law enforcement strategies. This isn't just historical research, it's intelligence that helps protect contemporary communities from similar criminal networks. Attorney General Foster provided details about the broader impact of the investigation that had grown from Margaret's discovery. Mrs. Chen, evidence from your ancestors' collection has helped solve 43 historical criminal cases across 17 states. More importantly, the organizational patterns we've identified are helping federal authorities recognize and combat similar networks that operate today. The emotional impact of providing justice for historical crime victims had become one of the most meaningful aspects of Margaret's experience. During the presidential visit, she met representatives from 12 descendant families who had traveled to Montana to personally thank her for finally providing answers about ancestors who had been victims of frontier-period crimes. Thomas Harrison, whose great-great-grandfather had been killed during a bank robbery in 1874, spoke for the group. Mrs. Chen, our families have wondered for 150 years what really happened to our ancestors and their property. Thanks to your integrity in preserving and sharing this evidence, we finally have truth and closure. The President witnessed these emotional reunions with visible understanding of the discovery's human impact. Mrs. Chen, you've given these families something more valuable than money. You've given them truth and the knowledge that their ancestors' suffering wasn't forgotten. Rachel's role in the discovery had earned her recognition that would shape her future in ways they never could have imagined. The President personally invited her to participate in a national youth leadership program focused on historical research and criminal justice, with full scholarship support for college and graduate studies in any field she chose. Rachel, your analytical skills and systematic approach to documenting this evidence have impressed federal investigators and academic researchers, the President told her. You've demonstrated that young people can make significant contributions to important national projects when given the opportunity and support. The research center establishment required congressional approval, which the President indicated would be forthcoming given the discovery's significance to national historical understanding and contemporary law enforcement capabilities. The funding would transform not only Margaret's family situation, but also the economic prospects for the entire Copper Ridge community. Governor Reynolds outlined the state's commitment to supporting the research center and ensuring that Montana received appropriate recognition for hosting one of the nation's most important historical sites. Mrs. Chen, this discovery will make Montana a destination for researchers, educators, and law enforcement professionals from around the world. As the presidential visit concluded, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun. With her desperate acceptance of an unexpected inheritance, from facing bankruptcy and homelessness, she had become the custodian of evidence that was rewriting American frontier history and helping solve some of the nation's oldest unsolved crimes. Mrs. Chen, your example demonstrates why integrity and public service remain central to American values, the President said in his closing remarks. You could have kept this discovery private and profited personally from what you found. Instead, you chose to serve justice and historical truth, and in doing so, you've served your fellow citizens in ways that will benefit generations to come. The federal compensation for Margaret's cooperation had resolved her immediate financial crisis while providing long-term security through consulting contracts and research center management. But more importantly, the discovery had given her family a meaningful purpose that extended far beyond personal recovery. Dr. Whitman approached Margaret with opportunities that would continue expanding her role in historical research. Mrs. Chen, universities across the country want to establish exchange programs with our research center. You'll have opportunities to lecture, consult on similar discoveries, and help train the next generation of frontier period researchers. The international interest in Ezra's preserved evidence had created opportunities for Margaret to participate in global conferences on historical crime investigation and evidence preservation. Academic institutions in Europe and Australia had requested access to the documentation for comparative studies of organized crime development in different frontier societies. Mum, do you ever think about what would have happened if Great-Aunt Evelyn hadn't left us the property? Rachel asked, as they watched the presidential motorcade depart toward the regional airport. Margaret considered her daughter's question, while looking across the Montana landscape that had been transformed from a symbol of their desperation into the center of one of the most significant historical discoveries in American law enforcement history. I think Evelyn knew exactly what she was setting in motion. Sometimes the people who care about us most are the ones who guide us toward opportunities we never could have imagined for ourselves. The research center construction would begin within 6 months, employing local workers and bringing sustained economic development to the Copper Ridge community. Margaret's role as director would provide meaningful work that honored Ezra's legacy while ensuring that his preserved evidence continued serving justice and historical understanding. Agent Torres, who had become a friend during the intensive investigation period, provided updates on the ongoing impact of Margaret's discovery. Mrs. Chen, federal authorities are using patterns identified in your ancestors' documentation to investigate contemporary financial crime networks. This discovery is literally helping solve current cases while providing closure for historical ones. As evening settled over the homestead, Margaret stood in the kitchen, where her life had been transformed by lifting a few carefully crafted floorboards. The hidden chamber below would soon become part of a world-class research facility, but tonight it remained the quiet repository of Ezra Blackwood's remarkable legacy. Sometimes our greatest challenges become the foundation for our greatest contributions, Margaret told Rachel as they prepared dinner in the kitchen that had become the epicenter of a discovery reshaping American frontier history. A year ago, we thought we had lost everything. Tonight, we're part of something that will help people understand truth and find justice for generations to come. The research center would ensure that Ezra's vision of justice served through patience and preservation would continue impacting American society long after Margaret's family had passed the responsibility to future generations. What had begun as a desperate widow's last hope for financial survival had become a legacy of integrity, service, and justice that would influence historical understanding and law enforcement capabilities for decades to come. 1 year later, Margaret stood in the newly completed research center's main hall, watching as students, researchers, and law enforcement professionals from around the world studied the evidence that had transformed her family's destiny while serving the cause of historical justice that Ezra Blackwood had envisioned 150 years earlier. 1 year after the presidential visit, Margaret stood at the podium of the newly constructed Ezra Blackwood Research Center for Historical Justice, addressing an international conference that would have seemed impossible during those desperate months when bankruptcy loomed over her family. The audience included law enforcement officials from 12 countries, historians from prestigious universities worldwide, and descendant families whose ancestors had been victims of crimes that Ezra's preserved evidence had finally helped solve. When I first lifted those floorboards in my inherited kitchen, I thought I was looking for anything that might help pay my late husband's medical bills, Margaret began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had discovered purpose through adversity. I never imagined I was uncovering evidence that would help solve 150-year-old crimes and establish new protocols for historical justice investigations. The research center had exceeded all projections for impact and international recognition. Built around the original Homestead, the facility now housed the world's most comprehensive collection of frontier-period criminal evidence, advanced preservation, laboratories, and training programs that had attracted students and professionals from 6 continents. Rachel, now completing her first year at Harvard University with a full scholarship in criminology and historical research, had returned to present her independent study on patterns of organized crime evolution from territorial periods to modern times. Her work, based on analysis of Ezra's documentation, had been published in 3 academic journals and cited by federal investigators working on contemporary cases. The most remarkable aspect of this discovery, Rachel told the international audience, isn't just the historical evidence itself, but how my great-great-great-grandfather designed a preservation system that anticipated future technological capabilities. He created documentation standards that meet modern forensic requirements 150 years before those standards were developed. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the center's newly appointed international research coordinator, had joined Margaret's team after completing groundbreaking work connecting Ezra's evidence to similar discoveries in Argentina and Australia. Her research suggested that organized criminal networks had operated globally during the 19th century with far more sophistication than historians had previously understood. Mrs. Chen's decision to prioritize justice over personal gain has enabled discoveries that extend far beyond American frontier history, Dr. Vasquez explained to the conference attendees. We're now tracking international criminal networks that operated across continents using evidence preservation techniques similar to what Ezra Blackwood developed independently in Montana. The center's impact on contemporary law enforcement had been documented by Agent Torres, who had been promoted to head the FBI's new Historical Crimes Analysis Division, based largely on insights gained from studying Ezra's preserved evidence. His presentation revealed how patterns identified in 19th-century criminal networks were helping federal authorities recognize and combat similar organizations operating today. The organizational structures, communication methods, and operational security measures used by frontier-period criminal networks are remarkably similar to techniques used by modern financial crime syndicates, Torres explained. Mrs. Chen's ancestor preserved a blueprint for understanding how these organizations evolve and adapt across different technological eras. Margaret had been invited to address similar conferences in London, Sydney, and Rome, where her experience had inspired the establishment of similar historical justice centers. The international network of researchers studying preserved evidence from historical crimes had grown to include institutions on every continent, with Margaret serving as the coordinating director for global research initiatives. The economic impact on Copper Ridge had transformed the small Montana community into an unexpected center for academic tourism and research activity. Local businesses had flourished as researchers, students, and visitors arrived to study at the center and explore the preserved homestead where the discovery had originated. Tom Reeves, the neighboring rancher who had first greeted Margaret during her initial visit to the property, now served as the center's community liaison, helping coordinate local support for the expanding research activities. His own family history had been enriched by the discovery when research revealed that his grandfather had been one of the territorial marshals who had corresponded with Ezra about criminal investigations. Margaret's courage in following those maps and contacting federal authorities changed all our lives, Tom told the international conference attendees. This community went from economic decline to becoming a global center for historical research. And every local family has benefited from the opportunities that created. The descendant families who had gained closure through Margaret's discovery had formed an organization dedicated to supporting similar historical justice efforts worldwide. Susan Morrison, whose great-great-grandmother's stolen jewelry had been preserved in Ezra's collection, had become the group's president and a powerful advocate for using modern technology to solve historical crimes. Margaret Chen gave us something we never thought possible: truth about what happened to our ancestors and knowledge that their suffering wasn't forgotten, Susan told the conference. But more importantly, she showed us that integrity and service to others creates legacies that last far longer than personal wealth or comfort. The research center's educational programs had attracted students from around the world, many of whom were following Rachel's example by pursuing careers that combined historical research with contemporary law enforcement applications. The scholarship program, funded by proceeds from the center's operations, had provided educational opportunities for over 200 students whose families had been affected by historical crimes. Dr. Whitman, now the center's Director of Academic Partnerships, presented research showing how the center's work was influencing university curricula worldwide. Margaret's discovery has created an entirely new field of study: historical justice research that combines traditional historical methods with modern forensic techniques to solve old crimes and provide closure for affected families. The show preservation techniques that Ezra had developed had been refined and modernized, creating new standards for historical evidence conservation that were being adopted by museums and archives globally. The patents and licensing agreements for these improved preservation methods provided ongoing funding for the center's research activities while ensuring that Ezra's innovations continued benefiting historical preservation efforts worldwide. Margaret's role had evolved far beyond her initial desperate search for financial stability. As director of the Research Center and coordinator of international historical justice initiatives, she traveled regularly to advise other institutions on establishing similar programs. Her expertise was sought by governments, universities, and law enforcement agencies facing their own challenges with unsolved historical crimes. The center's digital archives had made Ezra's preserved evidence accessible to researchers worldwide, while maintaining the highest security standards for sensitive materials. Virtual reality presentations allowed visitors to experience the discovery process and understand the historical context of frontier-period criminal networks without compromising the original evidence. Professor Hawthorne from Harvard had established a permanent research residency at the center, leading studies that connected frontier criminal organizations to the development of modern corporate crime techniques. Her work suggested that many contemporary financial crime patterns had their origins in the sophisticated networks that Ezra had documented. The continuity between 19th century and 21st century organized crime is remarkable, Professor Hawthorne explained to the conference. Mrs. Chen's ancestor preserved evidence showing that these criminal organizations were far more sophisticated and internationally connected than anyone previously understood. The center's impact on contemporary criminal justice had been recognized by international law enforcement organizations, with Interpol establishing a partnership to study how historical crime patterns could inform modern investigation techniques. Margaret had been invited to address the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime about the center's contribution to understanding transnational criminal network evolution. Rachel's academic achievements had attracted attention from federal agencies, interested in recruiting her for specialized positions, combining historical research with contemporary investigation work. However, she had decided to complete her education first, planning to return to the center eventually to continue the family legacy of service that Ezra had established. "I used to think college was impossible because we couldn't afford it," Rachel told the conference attendees. "Now, I'm studying at Harvard on scholarship, conducting research that helps solve crimes, and planning a career that will let me continue the work my family started." Sometimes, our biggest challenges really do become our greatest opportunities. The international partnerships that had grown from Margaret's discovery were facilitating similar historical justice projects on every continent. Archaeological teams were using techniques developed at the center to investigate preserved evidence from historical crimes in locations ranging from Australian gold rush sites to European trade route settlements. Dr. Martinez, who had been promoted to head the Treasury Department's Historical Financial Crimes Division, provided updates on how the center's research was influencing contemporary federal policy. The patterns Mrs. Chen's ancestor documented are helping us understand how financial crime networks adapt to technological changes, which informs our strategies for combating modern economic crimes. The emotional impact of providing justice. For historical crime, victims had continued to be one of the most meaningful aspects of the center's work. Margaret regularly met with descendant families whose ancestors had been victims of crimes that the center's research had helped solve, experiencing repeatedly the profound satisfaction of providing truth and closure after generations of uncertainty. James Whitfield, whose ancestor had been killed during a train robbery in 1872, spoke for many descendant families. Margaret didn't just discover evidence. She gave our families back our history. We finally know what happened to our ancestor and understand that his death wasn't meaningless because the criminals were eventually identified and their crimes documented. The center's success had inspired federal legislation, creating a national program for historical justice research, with funding to establish similar centers in other regions where significant historical crimes remained unsolved. Margaret had been invited to testify before Congress about the program's potential impact and serve on the advisory board overseeing the national initiative. Governor Reynolds had used the center's success as a model for economic development, through historical preservation, establishing Montana as a leader in combining tourism, education, and research around historical sites. The state's investment in supporting the center had generated economic returns far exceeding initial projections, while establishing Montana's reputation as a destination for serious historical research. The research center's work had attracted attention from documentary filmmakers, authors, and journalists interested in telling the story of how a desperate widow's discovery had transformed understanding of American frontier history while providing justice for historical crime victims. Margaret had been careful to ensure that media attention focused on the center's mission and impact rather than personal recognition. Agent Torres, reflecting on how the investigation had shaped his career and federal law enforcement capabilities, told the conference, Mrs. Chen's integrity in handling this discovery created opportunities for law enforcement cooperation and historical research that wouldn't have been possible if the evidence had been handled differently. Her example demonstrates how individual choices can have impacts far beyond anything we imagine at the time. The center's influence on academic research had been documented through hundreds of scholarly papers, dozens of books, and multiple PhD dissertations that had emerged from access to Ezra's preserved evidence. The intellectual property licensing agreements for research access provided sustainable funding for the center's operations, while ensuring that academic benefits reached institutions worldwide. Margaret's transformation from bankruptcy-threatened widow to internationally recognized expert in historical justice research had been documented as an inspirational example of how individuals could create positive change through integrity and perseverance. Her speaking engagements at universities, law enforcement conferences, and community organizations had inspired countless people facing their own seemingly insurmountable challenges. When David was dying and medical bills were destroying our financial security, I thought our story was ending, Margaret told the conference attendees. I never imagined it was actually beginning. Sometimes what looks like our greatest failure is actually preparation for our most important contribution. The center's educational outreach programs had reached thousands of students worldwide, teaching them about historical research methods, criminal justice principles, and the importance of integrity in handling significant discoveries. Many students who had participated in the center's programs were pursuing careers in law enforcement, historical research, or related fields inspired by Margaret's example. As the international conference concluded with commitments to expand global cooperation in historical justice research, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with her desperate acceptance of an unexpected inheritance. The financial security that had seemed impossible during those dark months of bankruptcy proceedings had been achieved through service to justice and historical truth rather than personal enrichment. The center's mission statement, displayed prominently in the main hall, captured the philosophy that had guided Margaret's decisions throughout the discovery process. Historical justice serves the future by honoring the past, providing truth to those who have waited for answers, and demonstrating that integrity and service create legacies that endure far beyond individual lifetimes. Standing in the research center that had grown from her kitchen floor discovery, surrounded by researchers, law enforcement professionals, and descendant families whose lives had been touched by Ezra's preserved evidence, Margaret understood that her great-aunt Evelyn's carefully planned inheritance had been far more than property or artifacts. It had been an invitation to participate in a legacy of justice that spanned generations and would continue impacting lives long after her family's role had passed to others. The transformation from desperate widow to custodian of one of the most significant historical discoveries in American criminal justice history demonstrated the profound truth that sometimes our greatest challenges become the foundation for our most meaningful contributions to others and to history itself. 5 years after that first desperate winter morning, when Margaret had stared at the dilapidated homestead, she stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, delivering a keynote address that would establish new international protocols for historical justice research. The transformation seemed impossible even to her, from a bankrupt widow facing foreclosure to addressing world leaders about revolutionizing how humanity approaches unsolved historical crimes. Distinguished delegates, what began as one family's search for survival has demonstrated that individual integrity can create ripple effects across generations and continents. Margaret began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen impossible dreams become reality through perseverance and principle. The evidence preserved by my ancestor 150 years ago has now helped solve over 300 historical crimes across 17 countries, providing closure for thousands of families while establishing new standards for international cooperation in historical justice. The UN had invited Margaret to propose the Global Historical Justice Initiative after the success of the Montana Research Center had inspired similar discoveries worldwide. Archaeological teams using techniques developed at her center had uncovered preserved evidence of historical crimes in locations ranging from South African diamond mines to Canadian fur trading posts, each discovery building upon the foundation that Ezra Blackwood's meticulous preservation methods had established. Rachel, now completing her doctoral dissertation at Oxford University on transnational criminal networks in historical context, had accompanied her mother to New York. Her research, combining insights from 12 international historical justice centers, was reshaping how academics and law enforcement understood the evolution of organized crime across different cultures and time periods. The pattern recognition techniques we developed analyzing great-great-great-grandfather Ezra's documentation are now being used to identify criminal network evolution spanning 3 centuries, Rachel explained to the UN's Crime Prevention Committee. We've discovered that criminal organizations have always been more internationally connected than historians previously understood, and this knowledge is helping modern law enforcement anticipate and prevent contemporary criminal activities. Dr. Vasquez had been appointed as the initiative's international coordinator, establishing partnerships between historical justice centers on 6 continents. Her latest research had revealed connections between 19th-century criminal networks and contemporary trafficking organizations, demonstrating how criminal methodologies persist and evolve across generations with remarkable consistency. Mrs. Chen's ancestor preserved more than evidence. He preserved a methodology for understanding how criminal organizations adapt to changing technological and social conditions, Dr. Vasquez told the UN Assembly. This understanding is proving invaluable for predicting and preventing modern criminal activities that follow patterns established over a century ago. The economic impact of the Global Historical Justice Initiative had exceeded all projections, creating sustainable employment for communities worldwide while generating billions of dollars in recovered assets and compensation for descendant families. The initiative had also sparked a renaissance in archaeological tourism, with people traveling globally to visit sites where historical crimes had been solved through preserved evidence. Margaret's hometown of Copper Ridge had become an international destination for researchers and visitors interested in experiencing the birthplace of modern historical justice research. The local economy had been completely transformed, with unemployment virtually eliminated as residents found work in the expanding research center, hospitality industries, and related businesses that had emerged around the discovery. Tom Reeves, now serving as mayor of Copper Ridge, had witnessed the community's transformation from economic decline to international prominence. Margaret's courage in following her conscience, instead of keeping that treasure for herself, created opportunities for our entire region, he told the UN delegation during their visit to Montana. Young people who once left for opportunities elsewhere are now returning to build careers in our community. The center's educational programs had evolved into a full university partnership, with students from around the world completing degrees in historical justice studies while conducting research using Ezra's preserved evidence. The graduation ceremony each spring brought together students whose families had been affected by historical crimes, creating powerful emotional connections between past injustices and future prevention efforts. Professor Hawthorne, now directing the Global Criminal Pattern Analysis Project, had documented how the initiative was influencing law enforcement training worldwide. Police academies on every continent were incorporating historical crime pattern analysis into their curricula, using techniques developed from studying 19th-century evidence to understand contemporary criminal behavior. The criminal methodologies Mrs. Chen's ancestor documented provide insights into human behavior patterns that transcend specific historical periods. Professor Hawthorne explained to the UN Assembly, understanding how criminal organizations operated 150 years ago helps us predict how they'll adapt to future technological and social changes. The initiative's impact on contemporary law enforcement had been revolutionary. Agent Torres, now directing the International Historical Crimes Analysis Consortium, regularly briefed world leaders on how historical crime pattern analysis was preventing modern criminal activities and helping solve contemporary cases that had seemed impossible to crack. The organizational structures, communication methods, and operational security measures documented in 19th-century criminal networks are remarkably similar to techniques used by modern cybercrime syndicates and financial fraud organizations, Torres explained to Interpol leadership. Historical pattern analysis is giving us predictive capabilities that are revolutionizing international law enforcement cooperation. The emotional impact of providing justice for historical crime victims had continued to be the most meaningful aspect of the initiative's work. Margaret regularly traveled to meet with descendant families whose ancestors had been victims of crimes that the expanding network of historical justice centers had helped solve, experiencing repeatedly the profound satisfaction of transforming generational trauma into closure and healing. Maria Santos, whose great-grandmother had been murdered during a mining claim dispute in Colorado in 1882, represented hundreds of families who had gained closure through the initiative. Margaret Chen didn't just discover evidence, she created a global movement that's healing wounds our families carried for generations. We finally have truth, justice, and the knowledge that our ancestors' suffering led to something meaningful. The initiative's influence on international diplomatic relations had been unexpected but significant. Countries that had been unable to cooperate on other issues found common ground in supporting historical justice research, creating new channels for diplomatic engagement and cultural exchange around shared commitment to truth and reconciliation. The Vatican had established a special commission to study how the initiative's methods could be applied to investigating historical injustices within religious contexts, while the European Union had funded a comprehensive program to address historical crimes related to territorial disputes and cultural conflicts that had shaped European development for centuries. Margaret's role had expanded far beyond research center management to include serving on international advisory boards, consulting with governments on historical justice policies, and inspiring similar initiatives worldwide. Her expertise was sought by institutions ranging from the International Criminal Court to the World Bank, which had recognized the economic development potential of historical justice tourism. The center's technological innovations had created new industries around historical evidence preservation and analysis. The patents and licensing agreements for advanced preservation methods, pattern recognition software, and virtual reality historical recreation systems were generating revenue streams that funded expansion of historical justice research worldwide. Rachel's academic achievements had led to offers from universities and government agencies around the world, but she had chosen to continue building upon her family's legacy by establishing the next generation of historical justice research methodologies. Her work was creating career paths for young people whose communities had been affected by historical crimes. "I used to think my future was limited by our family's financial struggles," Rachel told university students during her guest lectures. "Now I'm creating research methods that will help solve historical crimes for decades to come. Sometimes our greatest limitations become the foundation for our most meaningful contributions." The initiative's success had inspired federal legislation in multiple countries, creating national programs for historical justice research, with funding to establish research centers in regions where significant historical crimes remained unsolved. Margaret had been invited to advise governments on every continent about implementing similar programs, the emotional reunion ceremonies that brought together descendant families of crime victims with descendants of those who had preserved evidence, had become annual events at historical justice centers worldwide. These gatherings demonstrated the healing power of truth and the importance of preserving evidence for future generations who could ensure proper justice. Dr. Martinez, now heading the International Financial Crimes Historical Analysis Division, had documented how the initiative was transforming contemporary financial crime investigation by applying pattern analysis techniques developed from studying historical evidence. Modern financial crime prevention programs were using insights from 19th-century criminal networks to identify and stop contemporary fraud schemes. The continuity between historical and modern financial crime patterns is remarkable, Dr. Martinez explained to the World Economic Forum. Mrs. Chen's ancestor preserved evidence that's helping us understand how criminal organizations have always adapted to technological changes, which gives us unprecedented ability to predict and prevent modern economic crimes. The initiative's impact on academic research had been transformative, generating thousands of scholarly papers, hundreds of books, and numerous documentary films that had educated millions of people worldwide about the importance of historical justice and the power of individual integrity to create lasting change. Margaret's transformation from desperate widow to internationally recognized leader in historical justice had been documented as an inspirational example of how individuals could overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges through integrity, perseverance, and commitment to serving others rather than pursuing personal gain. The research center's visitor program had hosted delegations from over 100 countries, with government officials, law enforcement leaders, and academic researchers traveling to Montana to study the methods that had revolutionized historical crime investigation. The center had become a pilgrimage site for people seeking inspiration for overcoming their own challenges. When medical bills destroyed our financial security and I thought our family's story was ending, I never imagined we were actually at the beginning of something that would impact people worldwide, Margaret told international visitors. Sometimes, what looks like our greatest failure is actually preparation for our most important service to others. The center's outreach programs had reached millions of students globally through virtual reality experiences, online courses, and educational partnerships that taught young people about historical research methods, criminal justice principles, and the importance of integrity in handling significant discoveries. The Global Historical Justice Initiative had created a new model for international cooperation, demonstrating how shared commitment to truth and justice could transcend political boundaries and cultural differences. The initiative's success had inspired similar international programs addressing other historical injustices, from human rights violations to environmental crimes. As Margaret concluded her address to the UN General Assembly, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with her desperate acceptance of an unexpected inheritance. The financial security that had seemed impossible during those dark months of bankruptcy proceedings had been achieved not through personal enrichment, but through service to justice and historical truth that had created benefits extending far beyond her family's needs. The standing ovation from world leaders, representing 193 countries, demonstrated the global recognition of what had been accomplished through one family's decision to prioritize integrity over immediate personal gain. The unanimous approval of the Global Historical Justice Initiative established new international standards for cooperation in solving historical crimes while providing sustainable economic development for communities worldwide. Standing at the podium where world leaders had committed to supporting historical justice research worldwide, Margaret understood that her great-aunt Evelyn's carefully planned inheritance had been an invitation to participate in something far greater than personal survival. It had been an opportunity to demonstrate that individual integrity and commitment to serving others could create legacies that transcended generations and transformed how humanity approached justice, truth, and healing from historical wounds. The initiative that had grown from lifting floorboards in a Montana kitchen had become a global movement, proving that sometimes our greatest challenges are actually doorways to our most meaningful contributions to the world. The transformation from bankrupt widow to international leader in historical justice research demonstrated the profound truth that integrity, perseverance, and service to others create opportunities that no amount of personal wealth could purchase. As delegates from around the world committed to establishing historical justice centers in their own countries, Margaret knew that Ezra Blackwood's vision of justice served through patience and preservation would continue impacting humanity for generations to come, proving that individual choices made with integrity and courage can indeed change the world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.